Where do phrasal verbs come from? Were they invented or made up by a committee of teachers and professors at Cambridge University in order to make English even more difficult to learn? Is that it? Learn some things about phrasal verbs, what to do if you're not using your advanced grammar, and much more in this episode of
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with nearly 50 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are things, Craig?
Things are very well. I'm really excited to get podcasting again. We've got lots of voice messages, follow-up and feedback. So yeah, really happy about getting stuck into this week's podcast. How are you doing?
I'm ticking along nicely. Yeah, I can't complain. Everything's fine.
Is that a phrasal verb, to tick along?
To tick along, that means not do anything special, but just continue doing what you're doing without any problems. I'm ticking along.
Pleased to hear it. First this week, we have a voice message from Eduardo from Venezuela.
Hello, Reza. Hello, Craig. My name is Eduardo. I'm from Venezuela, and currently I'm living in Cordoba, Argentina. I've been listening to your podcast from 8 months ago, and I would like to say thank you for making podcasts and helping all the English learners like me. You are rocking now, definitely. Sometimes I feel lost when I listen to words like despite, even though, although. To be honest, I don't know when I should use it and how to interpret it. I will be so glad if you could help me with this. Again, thank you very much in advance.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. It's really good to hear from you, and we enjoyed your message. It's very clear. We understood everything you said. I really liked your expression, to be honest, which makes me laugh when people say that expression. To be honest, I find it difficult to speak Spanish. To be honest, I mean, is it that people aren't usually honest, but now they're being honest? But it's a really nice expression and you used it very naturally, so well done.
Yes, I would say the same as Craig. I found you very easy to follow, although I did notice one little grammar mistake. You said, I've been listening to your podcast 8 months ago. We can't combine for and ago like that. You should say, I've been listening to your podcast for 8 months. If you wanted to use the word ago, you could say since 8 months ago. You could say that, but it's just much easier, as I said, to say for 8 months.
And your question, Eduardo, the confusion that you're having is with linking words, connecting expressions like although, despite, even though, etc. We have done 2 or 3 podcasts specifically about that. So let me point you to those first. Have a listen. And then if things are still not clear, if you have any more questions, then of course get in touch, contact us for clarification. So episode 55 was on linking words like but, even though, although, however, in spite of, and despite. So go to inglespodcast.com/55. Episode 32 was about although, even though, despite, and in spite of. inglespodcast.com/32. And finally, episode 133 discussed adverbial clauses, linkers, and conjunctions. So very specifically, the area that you want to study further. So that's inglespodcast.com/133. And if anything's not clear, please get in touch with us again.
We've got another voice message. This time it's from David from Colombia.
Yeah, David refers to an episode we did recently about going back in time, travelling back in time and changing something. Do you remember, Reza, we spoke, I think we both agreed that maybe Hitler would be something we'd like to change?
If we could change a historical event, that was it.
That was it. So I think that's the episode that David is referring to. Let's listen to his message.
Hi guys, how are you? I hope you're fine. My name is David. I'm from Colombia, Medellin. Medellin is a very beautiful city. I don't know if you know something about it. Thanks for everything you do. Nice work. Well, I want to say something about the question. What would I do if I could travel back in time? Well, I stopped the discovering of the oil. I think that has caused many destruction, to the nature. Well, that's it. Thank you again for what you do. Correct me in my mistakes. And it's amazing to try to speak in English. Goodbye. Have a nice and beautiful day.
Thank you very much for the message, David. It's always a pleasure to know that people are listening to us when we're podcasting about things and you've come back and answered the questions. So what do you think, Reza? Getting rid of oil, the discovery of oil. In fact, one thing David said was to stop discovering of the oil, but you don't need the verb there. Stop the discovery of oil would be better. So use the noun. You want to stop the discovery of oil. Go back in time and do that. What do you think?
I see what you're saying, David, but you've got to see that it would be a very different world without oil. How would we get from A to B?
Electric cars.
Yep. Would we though? I like to think you're right. But I see problems with that as well. But yeah, if there weren't oil, there wouldn't be so much pollution. There wouldn't be so much CO2. Yeah, it's a nice thought. What do you think, Craig?
I love the idea, especially there's been a recent disaster. We're speaking in September 2020, and a month ago there was an oil disaster. A Japanese oil tanker broke. Was it near Mauritius? And near a beautiful coral reef? And that really does make me sad when that happens. So it would be wonderful if we could live without oil, although I'm not sure how practical it would be. One final thing, David, you said, correct me my mistake. What you've done there is you've used two objects. So you can say, please correct me, full stop, that's it. Or you can say, please correct my mistakes. Just use one object after correct. Reza, what's next?
We've got another voice message, this time a little bit further south of Colombia. It's from Denise from Brazil.
Hello guys, my name is Denise. I live in Brazil and I would like to know if you could help me with something. I've been studying English for like 6 or maybe 7 years now, and one thing that bothers me a lot is the fact that I don't use all the complex grammar I learned at university, and some words I do understand their meaning and I know how to use them, but when I have to choose the word that I'm gonna say to someone else or maybe write to someone else, I just don't do it. They don't come out that easily. So I was wondering if that's normal or if I'm being lazy, if I should just try harder. I really need some help. I'm looking forward to moving to Canada in a couple of years, and I would like to get there with a very, very good English level. So please, will you help me? Bye.
Hi Denise, thank you for getting in touch. It's lovely to hear from you, and what a lovely message. Really beautiful pronunciation, fantastic English, and I don't know if you agree, Reza, but I could not hear one mistake in her message.
No mistakes at all of pronunciation, of grammar, of vocabulary. But I guess that's not your point, is it? Your point is that you want to use more advanced grammar, so You don't make many mistakes. In fact, from what we've seen, you don't make any mistakes. And believe me, Denise, that's the most important thing. Now, yeah, it's great if you can use a range of vocabulary and grammar as well. But the most important thing is to be accurate and to use a variety, even if it's not a very advanced variety. And you did use a variety there. In fact, the way you spoke there was very, very typical of a native speaker. Don't think, Denise and everybody else, that native speakers on an average typical day use a lot of advanced grammar. They don't. They might use the odd expression, one or two, but you can have a perfectly clear and useful and very effective conversation with somebody without necessarily using very advanced grammar. So I wouldn't get too obsessed with it, but you're right, it is a good idea to show off what you know. So what could we suggest, Craig?
Well, I'll add to that not only the grammar, advanced grammar, people don't usually use a very wide range of vocabulary in everyday conversation. If you look at Reza and I, for example, I don't know if you agree, but on a day-to-day basis, I don't use advanced Spanish grammar. I don't use a very wide vocabulary because basically I'm going to the shops and I'm dealing with maybe bureaucracy, and I'm not speaking at a very, very high level about complicated, abstract things. Now, what you could do, Denise, in preparation to going to Canada, depending on the reason you're going, I don't think you mentioned if you're going to work or going to study, but depending on what your aim is in Canada, you could start preparing now with a private teacher. So that would mean you would connect online to a personal teacher with the specific aim of improving your English based on what you're going to be doing when you get to Canada. So your English at the moment is absolutely fantastic. I think also there's a good reason for focusing and specializing in the kind of English you're going to be using when you're working or studying in Canada. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good idea. And also in your free time, outside the classroom environment, apart from getting a tutor, be very selective about the material you use. So obviously there's a chance of hearing more advanced vocabulary and perhaps grammar. If you watch and listen to a TED Talk about genetics, let's say, than a Tom and Jerry cartoon. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? That's an extreme example. So in a Tom and Jerry cartoon, you're going to hear, "Oh, stop. He kicked me and I'm going to get you." But in the TED Talk about genetics, you're going to hear about things like the sample was subjected to intensive research, things like that, which are more advanced. You've got passive verbs, you've got a more formal and a greater range of vocabulary using nouns rather than verbs. So think to yourself, what is the source? Where am I getting my material from? And think, is that likely to be a more advanced, a more academic, a more formal type of English? And if that's the English you're interested in, we'll try to keep to those type of sources. TED Talks for everybody, by the way, is a great source.
One more comment I'll add to that. Did Tom and Jerry actually speak?
That's true.
They didn't, did they?
Some humans speak, don't they, in the cartoons?
The woman
goes, "Tom, what you been doing, you naughty cat?"
And you just see the legs of the woman and her skirts. Yeah, but I don't think Tom and Jerry ever spoke.
That's true. And she didn't say much either. And what she said, the woman was always saying, "I'm going to whoop you, pussycat," and that type of thing. You've been a bad cat. And by the way, yes, she did have that accent. I'm not making it up.
So Denise and anyone in a similar situation, before you start to get a bit stressed and frustrated that you're not using all the English you've learned, ask the question, do you really need it? Reza and I in Spain, for example, maybe we should expand our vocabulary, expand and use advanced grammar, but on a day-to-day basis, we don't actually need it. But having said that, we're not communicating at a very high level in Spanish. Do you agree with that?
Yes. And one thing, Denise, I don't know what your area of work is, your line of work, but try to use a lot of material to practice related to your job or your areas of interest, and really focus on the type of language that they use and try and practice that. So, for example, I don't know, you might be an IT specialist. Well, watch TED Talks and read articles and watch videos about IT. That way, hopefully, you get a more advanced set of vocabulary and grammar, albeit that means, although I admit specifically about IT, but that's useful advanced vocabulary. There's not much point for you. For example, imagine if you're an IT specialist getting really advanced language about sports physiotherapy, because you're not a sports physiotherapist. So why would you want it? I don't know it. You know what I mean? So concentrate on what's going to be useful for you.
Next, we have a voice message from a good friend of the show, Dominique from France.
Hi Reza, hi Craig, it's Dominique from France. I really enjoyed listening to the podcast, A History of the English Language. It was really interesting and very informative. Could you tell me more about the origin, the history of phrasal verbs? When they were spoken for the first time? In which century? I think for many phrasal verbs, there are a verb more elaborated, which comes from a French verb. For example, carry on, phrasal verb, more elaborated verb, continue, and in French, continuer. Second example, pop in, phrasal verb, more elaborated verb, visit, and in French, visiter. Thank you for telling me if I am wrong. Bye-bye.
Bonjour, Dominique. Thank you for getting in touch again. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. And an interesting question about phrasal verbs. We don't get many questions about phrasal verbs, do we?
No, we don't. Hi, Dominique. Thanks for your question. You clearly have a deep interest in not only using the language, but its origins. And you've picked phrasal verbs, which is a topic which torments many students because they have big problems with phrasal verbs. And you're specifically interested in the history. What can we tell Dominique about the history of phrasal verbs? Where do they come from? Are there equivalents? What do we know about phrasal verbs, Craig?
Well, before we look at just a very brief history of phrasal verbs and where they actually come from, just a quick correction for Dominique. I think you said, Dominique, there are a verb more elaborated. It's better to say there are more elaborate verbs. There are more elaborate verbs. So change the position of elaborate and put it before the noun. So, a history of phrasal verbs. The episode that Dominique was referring to, in which we spoke about the history of the English language, was episode 320. So, if you're interested in that, and apparently Dominique quite enjoyed it, go to inglespodcast.com/320. Now, Reza said at the beginning, is there a committee in the University of Cambridge or Oxford who sit every month and think, how can we make English more difficult for students to learn? I know, let's give them some more phrasal verbs because they're horrible. Well, actually, no, that's not where phrasal verbs come from. If you go back to Old English, and we spoke about Old English in episode 320, they didn't really have phrasal verbs as we know them today. But they had something similar. They had something called prefix verbs. Now, from the word pre, you know that it's something that's at the beginning. So it's at the beginning of the verb. And that particle or preposition that goes with a phrasal verb was actually attached to the beginning of the verb. Let me give you an example. There's a phrasal verb that is burn up. To burn up. Now, in Old English, there's a verb burnan, which is to burn. And what they did years and years and years and years ago in Old English, they put something at the beginning of burnan to make it a phrasal verb. So it was forburnan, they used to say centuries ago, which really means to burn up. The up, by the way, in that phrasal verb gives the idea of completion, something that's completed, because sometimes at the end of the podcast we say, let's wrap up, which means let's finish. If your mum says, come on, eat up your vegetables, that means finish eating your vegetables, or drink up, finish your drink. So in this case, burn up means completely burn.
So this language that Craig's talking about would have been the language of the original Anglo-Saxons. So we're talking about kind of between the 5th and 10th centuries. But as you said, Dominique, English started to borrow French words, and it all started in 1066. From then onwards, the phrasal verb started to slow down a little bit in its growth. But from then onwards, the French language began to have a heavy influence on English. And that's simply because of the Norman invasion. The Normans, so we can't say just the French, we have to specify the Normans because there was no such country as France even at that time. The Normans from Normandy invaded England, and this affected the language. So their Romance language, French, or their Norman version of French, was mostly based on Latin. We call that a Romance language. Think of Rome, Roman, Romance. And so their vocabulary began to filter into the English language. So that meant not so much dependence on phrasal verbs, and quite often giving an equivalent of a phrasal verb.
Can you give an example?
Yes, so for example, to break up, which in Old English would have been for bracken, to break up, well, that's basically to destroy, isn't it? So the French already had their word détruire, so that got converted into English and came out as destroy. So we took the French word and sometimes we changed it a little bit and came up with a new English word.
And at that time, class, social class, played a role too. To play a role means had a significant effect or significant involvement. Role is papel. So the idea of class was very important because French was considered to be the language of highest status in society after 1066. So you had lots of French and French influence into England, and phrasal verbs were considered informal, as they are today. Phrasal verbs were considered by the French elite to be working class words. People used them who worked in the fields, in agriculture, manual workers, you might say peasants, people who did not have any upper standing in society used phrasal verbs. So class was a big factor in phrasal verbs being used a lot less in the language.
It all makes sense if you think about it, because the Romans were very sophisticated for their day, very ahead of their time. So the countries or areas where there'd been more Roman influence, such as France, Spain, etc., their languages were more closely related to Latin, the language of the Romans, and therefore considered of a higher status, more academic than the languages which had existed before. So it's all about the fact that the Romans were very sophisticated. For example, the word education, educate, comes from the Latin educare. There was no way of saying that in English before, because we didn't really think about education until the Romans arrived, really the Greeks before that, but the Greeks didn't come to England, the Romans did, and their ideas of schools and things like that, the concept hadn't really been thought about in England. So words like that, words to do with education and academic things, tend to come from Latin, so they won't be phrasal verbs, probably.
And if you jump forward now to the 16th century, to Shakespeare's time, the time of early modern English, phrasal verbs blew up. Yeah, you see, used a phrasal verb. They exploded. Lots more phrasal verbs came into the language, partly because of Shakespeare. In fact, there have been 5,744 phrasal verbs identified in all of Shakespeare's works, all of his plays and sonnets, etc. Just let me point out here that I used works as a countable noun. Now, you've heard us say many times that a job is countable and work is uncountable. Well, yes, except when you're talking about obras d'arte, then you can use it as a countable noun. So Shakespeare's works included his plays, his sonnets, everything he wrote. So many phrasal verbs came into the language during the time of Shakespeare in the 16th century.
So yeah, Shakespeare basically then helped, let's say, with the revival of phrasal verbs. So they had kind of gone out of prominence because of the Norman invasion, etc. But then in modern English, early modern English, the 16th century, they came back. There's a phrasal verb. They made a comeback and they have flourished ever since. Mind you means all the same, or don't forget that still though, very often if you're thinking of formality or class, if there is a choice of phrasal verb or non-phrasal verb, even to this day, we generally consider the phrasal verb to be less formal. So if there's another way of saying something which isn't a phrasal verb, it's probably more formal than the phrasal verb, even today.
Yeah, so remember that if you're studying for an exam and you have to do academic writing, formal writing, try to use the full verb and not the phrasal verb. So in Dominique's message, she mentioned two phrasal verbs that have equivalent verbs in English and in French. She mentioned carry on, continue, and pop in, which means to visit. You can also say pop round or pop over. So let's look at some more phrasal verbs that have equivalent verbs that are more or less interchangeable. Just remember that the phrasal verb tends to be more informal. What's the first one, Reza?
Postpone. So you postpone something, you put it back. That means you haven't cancelled it altogether. It's going to happen, but just later than you had originally planned. So to put something back is postpone.
Have you put back your holiday this year?
I have. No, I tell a lie. I haven't put back my holiday. I've called it off altogether.
Have you?
That's different. Another phrasal verb. I've had to cancel it. Call off is more than postponed. I'm not going to have a holiday. I've cancelled it. I've called off my holiday.
Remember, you can see a list of these verbs in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/331. The next one is to set up, the phrasal verb to set up, which means arrange. Now, you can set up a meeting, or you can physically set up something in your house, for example. Let's imagine you're creating a new office space. You can set up your desk, you can set up a computer. If you buy a new printer for your computer, then you need to set up a printer. And you can also, as I said, set up a meeting. For example, Reza, when did we set up this podcasting session?
I think we set it up about a week ago, didn't we?
Yeah, about a week ago. We set it up. Notice we use the it there, the object in the middle of the phrasal verb, set it up.
Craig's already mentioned the word work. We have a phrasal verb, using work, to work out. To work out can mean to calculate something. So I had a mathematical problem. It was very difficult, but eventually I worked it out. I calculated it. I found a solution to work out.
To give up means to stop or surrender. For example, if I ask Reza, who took the last chocolate biscuit? Do you know?
I've no idea, Craig. I give up.
It was me.
Now I know. I'm not entirely surprised there. I thought we would find out in the end that Craig was responsible. Find out is discover. I had a feeling that we would find out Craig would be linked to the missing biscuits.
Yeah, sadly, every time I come to Reza's flat to record, and we're in Reza's flat today recording, he has to put up with me. To put up with a 3-word phrasal verb, put up with, means to tolerate. Tolerar in Spanish. So he has to tolerate me, or he has to put up with me. Sufrir.
These days, we're still under the restrictions of the coronavirus. We often talk about limiting how people might pass on the virus. Pass on, phrasal verb, means transmit. So we try everything we can to avoid passing on the virus.
Sometimes you may be offered, if you're lucky, a job opportunity, which you may accept, or you may decline or reject. So the phrasal verb you could use, which means reject something, is turn down. To turn down an offer, to turn down an opportunity. Have you ever turned down a job opportunity?
I have. It was because of the pay. I didn't think the pay was good enough, so I turned it down. To cut down on something, there's 2 prepositions there with the verb. To cut down on something is to reduce. Craig, after all my biscuits have gone missing, I really think it's time you cut down on sweet food.
Yeah, I definitely need to cut down on sugar. I'm eating too much.
I think you need to leave out chocolate from your diet for a while. Would you be capable of leaving out chocolate from your diet?
That would be very difficult for me. It would be very difficult for me to leave out chocolate from my daily intake of food. So to leave out means to omit. Do you think we left out anything from our history of phrasal verbs?
I think we've covered the basic points. Of course, there's a lot more detail than this, but I don't think you need to know any more than that. Just basically, everybody, remember the key points, that there often is another way of saying a phrasal verb, which isn't the phrasal verb. So, for example, to omit is to leave out. And if that's the case, the phrasal verb is probably more informal. I think that's the key information that you need to know.
And thank you very much, Dominique, for your idea for today's episode. If you can come up with an idea for a future episode, now come up with means to invent or think of. Why not tell us, let us know if you come up with an idea. You can contact us on SpeakPipe, that's speakpipe.com. That's where you go to record your audio message. Reza, how can people write to us?
You could send us an email. You've got Craig@inglespodcast.com or me, belfastreza@gmail.com.
And we'd like to remind you that on the Mansion Inglés webpage, there's a store where you can buy some paid courses for your English. That's store, store.mansioningles.net.
As ever, we're very grateful to all our sponsors on the Patreon scheme. They're people who donate money to us voluntarily. For that, they get recent transcriptions of all the audio with all the words. Maybe you'd like to join if you're interested in getting those transcriptions and helping us out. Have a look at Patreon. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Inglespodcast, and perhaps you might be interested in giving us a donation.
We'd like to say thank you to our recent Patreon supporters who have joined us. Reza, who are they?
The latest sponsors are Gerardo Manuel, Alvarinho, and Felipe Coelho. Thank you to all of you.
On next week's episode, we're looking at greetings, how to say hello and how to say goodbye. And you might think, well, I know how to say hello in English. I can say goodbye in English. Well, in my experience, students really don't know what to say next. So we're going to look at a whole range of ways you can greet people and say goodbye, and some small talk that gets the conversation going on what to say in English when you're in that situation of speaking to someone in the beginning. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's cheerio from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.